Hello students, within this chapter we'll be discussing the concepts of unemployment and inflation. And as you may recall from one of the first lectures we had, it's very important that as students of economics we understand what's happening in terms of unemployment and inflation, because they both give us an indication as to the health of the macro economy. So in terms of unemployment, one of the first things we're going to be looking at is what represent the true cost, albeit monetary or otherwise, in terms of being unemployed. First and foremost, with unemployment, there is a personal cost. If you're unemployed, it simply means then that what? You lose a paycheck. So your capacity to actually spend is somewhat curtailed. There tends to be a loss of self-esteem, because long and short of it is that if you're unemployed, you may not be able to provide for yourself. Unemployment also leads to an increase in stress-related psychological problems. It also, in some cases, can lead to an increase in the incidence of crime, suicide, and mental illness. Okay, so for instance, in many cases, well, you would have heard on the television, for instance, where in the US, for instance, persons who find themselves unemployed, some go berserk, some go back to the entity where they were once employed, do unbecoming things, etc. So at the bottom of that slide 2, you'll see an example where a person who would have found themselves unemployed would have gone at lengths to do these things because of the stress that is created from being unemployed. There's also an economic cost, because if persons are not employed, naturally there's a loss of output. Remember when we spoke of productivity and output in one of our previous chapters, we're saying that labor is an important component in terms of understanding the factors that will cause an economy to grow over time. Now, how do we measure unemployment? And one of the things I tell you up front is that the example that the book uses is that of a more or less a US definition. There's some similarities which will obviously come into play within our jurisdiction, but in terms of the actual categorizations, it's pretty much mirroring what obtains within the US. So the first one speaks to the civilian non-institutional adult population, and that constitute all civilians 16 years of age and older. It excludes institutionalized persons. It also excludes those in the military. Critically important for us is to understand the concept of the labor force. What does it mean by the labor force of a country? The labor force, as you can see from that bullet, it represents persons who are in the adult population who are either working or looking for work. So that's pretty much a standard definition throughout all jurisdictions, all countries, where the labor force comprises persons who are either working or looking for work. So make sure you understand that definition in terms of unemployment. How do we measure unemployment from slide 4? It says here now that unemployed, to be unemployed is a technical definition in terms of us understanding who is unemployed. And what this bullet is saying to you is that in order for you to be considered to be unemployed, you must be looking for a job. So it's those persons with no job but are actively seeking job. So from that we have then what's called your unemployment rate, which is a measure of the percentage of persons who are in the labor force, because remember from previous definition we define what is the labor force, who are what? Persons who are employed and those who are looking for a job. So the unemployment rate, it measures the percentage of those in the labor force who are unemployed. So it's like a fraction. It equals the number employed divided by the labor force. And that category or that rate basically excludes a term of persons called discouraged worker. Very important definition for you to grasp for your midterm. Discouraged worker. And discouraged workers are basically persons who would have found themselves unemployed. They were actively seeking jobs at one point, but for whatever reasons for the other, they have given up looking for a job altogether. So to the extent that they have given up looking for a job, they are not counted as being unemployed because they are no longer looking for a job. So these persons are not part of the labor force. So as I've indicated to you, when we speak of unemployment, it's a technical definition because in actuality they're not working, so you're not employed. But in order for you to be counted as part of the statistics, you have to be actively seeking a job. The next slide just basically gives you a graphical representation using actual statistics from the US. Tells you how much is the labor force, how much of that is employed. So obviously, you can then see now that within those who are technically not working, how much of those we will consider to be unemployed. And it's basically then the difference, the 146.8 minus the 138.6 will give you the 8.2. So it's easy for you to see mathematically when you look at that graph how the figures actually rolled up. Because again, the unemployed, they're not working, but they are not they're not counted as not being in the labor force unless they're actively seeking jobs. The next one speaks to what's called now the labor force participation rate. And it says, that basically is the number in the labor force divided by the adult population. All right? So obviously, for many economies, you want to make sure that most of your population is in the labor force. Because if that's not the case, the question is, who is providing that safety net for persons within the population who are not working? Is it the government? So then obviously, if that's the case, then there has to be some strain on the financial resources of the government. So it says here now that on average in the USA, 2 out of 3 adults are in the labor force, which is good. You want a high labor force participation rate. So it would have shown, for instance, now that rate would have increased from about 60% in 1970 to approximately 60% in the 1990s, and it has remained relatively stable since. So that's a US example. And it says, that there has been a convergence of the participation rate of both men and women over the last 40 years. Things have changed. You have men and women entering the labor force. It's not like times gone by whereby women basically stayed at home and were housemakers. You have women playing that dual role where they're actively working, they go and do the 8 to 4 and still have to then maintain their homes as the case may be. So that's what that last item is saying to you, is that there has been that convergence where both men and women would have found themselves within the labor force. What are the trends in the unemployment rate that we would have seen over the last 20 years? What he's saying to you is that there has been a decline, but certainly within the years 2008 to 2012 thereabout, with the global recession, certainly unemployment would have increased. So it'll be interesting to see from what 20-year period the book would have captured the statistics, because certainly it would not have been from recent times when we had the global financial crisis. And one of the reasons, okay, if you were to say that the trend is upward where employment is concerned, one of the reasons as to why unemployment would have declined is because economies would have grown. If economies grow, firms require more persons, the labor force obviously will then increase. And what he's saying to you is that over the years we are seeing relatively fewer teenagers in the workforce. The unemployment rate as we know it is just a statistic. So basically what you're saying to you is that you have to really get behind the figures, because the unemployment rate as we know it, it doesn't tell you anything about race. It doesn't tell you anything about gender. It doesn't tell you anything about geographical age or the occupational group. So if you're a policy maker and you realize there's a high level of unemployment and you want to bring into the macroeconomy some policy measure to tackle that level of unemployment, you must understand if it's by race, by gender, age, or geographical areas, or occupational group. Let's take, for instance, the US. The unemployment rate in the US is hypothetically 10%. Now, if you're a policymaker, the rate is just telling you what it is. If you want to then make a response to basically try and tackle that unemployment rate, suppose the unemployment problem is real in California. What would happen then if the policymakers target New York? Then the policy response will not be very effective, because it would have concentrated in an area where the unemployment rate is not high. If anything, the resources should have been deployed to California. It doesn't say anything about the occupational group. Let's say the unemployment group is actually men. Men are the ones who are unemployed. Now, if that's the case and you say you want to stimulate small industry, you want to stimulate cottage industry and so forth, how effective then would you be if you decide to roll out, let's say, sewing classes and classes for people to do, things that are traditionally done by women? It would not be effective. As opposed to, let's say, you're targeting small things that are traditionally done by men, let's say fishing and things to that effect. So you have to really understand which occupational group, which gender is being affected for any effective policy response in terms of tackling your level of unemployment within the macro economy. Same thing obtains in terms of age, same things would have obtained in terms of race. All right? The other thing now is that when we speak of unemployment, what are the various sources of unemployment within the macroeconomy? And as macroeconomists, we basically find ourselves discussing 4 types of unemployment within the macroeconomy. The first one being frictional unemployment, the second one being seasonal unemployment, the third one being structural unemployment, and the fourth one being cyclical unemployment. Frictional, seasonal, structural, and cyclical. So this is going to be the first part 1 of this chapter on unemployment and inflation. Within the second part, we're going to now discuss in greater detail what is meant by frictional unemployment, what is meant by seasonal unemployment, what is meant by structural unemployment, and what is meant by the term cyclical unemployment.